started then on the third of our lectures on art and Christianity. We've had a little bit of a gap since our last talk, which was about 3 or so weeks ago, but as so often happens at this time of the year, various feast days and other observances can get in the way of our post-mass offerings. For those of you joining us online, you are very welcome, and there will be a written out copy of this talk available by email and in next week's parish e-letter. For those of you present in the room, in the Memorial Chapel here, you need to have a copy of the piece of artwork that we're having a look at today, and I will explain more about that in just a moment's time. As the time and date continue to spin towards the present day, we notice Christian art from the Baroque period through the Reformation and towards the 20th century begin to pick up the philosophy, the social ideas and the culture which comprise our modern world today. So we're moving now from the older pieces of art, such as that original funerary monument, the tomb of Junius Bassus in the 6th century, and then we were looking at some art by Ferrari, not the car, Ferrari, the Italian painter. We were looking at some Baroque art several weeks ago. We're now fast forwarding towards the 20th century, and we're realizing that as art becomes more modern, it picks up various different philosophical, intellectual ideas along the way. Perhaps chief amongst these philosophical twists and turns is the idea of doubt. The idea of doubting God and Christianity to be authentic or to be real. We think about the first followers of Jesus, the first followers of Christ, walking around and with him and baptizing new believers into his church, and then gradually the emergence of new human ideas means that Christianity as an established religion begins to be challenged by various developments in society. So we have this idea of doubt, the idea that human beings doubt God, doubt Christ, doubt the ideas of Christianity from first principles. This we see early on in the writings of Spinoza, in Pascal. These are the early modern thinkers who begin to disrupt our idea of Christianity in Europe. And then this idea of doubt comes to the foreground in a very immediate and powerful way in the writings of the 18th and the 19th centuries in Europe. Here we have the credentials of Christianity beginning to unravel under the critical eye of German and English philosophers in particular, who dispute the existence of Jesus Christ, the validity of a variety of Christian teachings, especially those of the Roman Catholic Church, and especially Christian teachings that are increasingly coming into contact with the development of natural science. Where did the world come from? Was it made in 7 days? How old is the world? If you read the Old Testament literally, the world's only a few thousand years old. We know from our natural science that the Earth as an orb, the Earth as a sphere, as a planet, is millions and millions of years old. So perhaps one of the greatest of these disrupting forces in the 19th century is a famous critique of Christianity by Ludwig Feuerbach called The Essence of Christianity in 1841, written in 1841. This was a text claiming that the personality of Christ was just really a psychological projection of man's need for love, for purpose and solidity. So we have all of these ideas in the modern era coming into play that are making art and Christianity have a complicated relationship. All of this comes to bear in our artistic world, the world of the visual aesthetic medium. So many of us will know some of our modern artistic champions, our big exponents of the modern idiom. We think of people like Pablo Picasso. The created order is distorted and changed in Picasso's Cubism, in Picasso's Surrealism. Body parts, objects, the background scenery of the human condition gets tangled up. There are no longer divine or straightforward rules governing the way in which we do art, governing the way in which we think about art and beauty, to shape the artist's sense of creativity. So that's why, when we look at modern art, we often are tempted to go, well, that doesn't make any sense. I remember having a conversation with you, Carmita. Do you remember on Easter Sunday? And you said that's not a very nice depiction of Jesus because it looked like he was doing some sort of belly dancing. I think you said. When we encounter modern art, when we encounter a type of artistic depiction that disrupts our ordered Christian ideals and virtues and rationalizations, if you like, we find it difficult to understand beauty, understand what is being set before us. This is what you see with Pablo Picasso. This is what you see with modern art in the 20th century. Cubism, the advent of abstract art, none of these things seek to represent some fact about the created order. There is no longer a sense of control or order or conformity which we would have seen in the art of the Baroque period, of the medieval world, of the antique world, the world into which Christ was born, of the Virgin Mary. And so the point is, Western art in the 20th century, after the advent of these new philosophical ideas, after the advent of doubt and doubt about Christian faith, it expresses and becomes characterized by a free flow of emotions, of psychological expression, which Christianity, perhaps earlier on in its history, has failed to codify or restrain or explain. If we go back to some of the earlier artists that we know from art galleries we might have visited in London or around the world, we can also see this same psychological struggle of the artist beginning to emerge, this idea of trying to escape conformity and regularity. If you look at the works of Rembrandt and other Dutch masters, you see in the faces of the saints and the individuals depicted by Rembrandt an attempt to come to terms with what it means to be called a son or a daughter of God. There's a certain struggle with Christianity from earlier on, but it's contained within the basis of believing God and Christianity to speak truth to us. That all changes. The idea of being made in God's image changes in the modern period. And that's why it's so important to look at modern art when we talk about Christianity in art. Because Christian art is not just about taking a Bible verse and putting it into a picture. That would be a very reduced and limited way to think about what art can mean for us as Christians today, and also for Christians of the past and of the future too. By the 20th century, we see an explosion outwards of these older ideas in favour of what might be called a more secular worldview, where art has its beginnings and has its end in the subject. The artist has its end in me. Whoever the artist might be, there is a struggle to try and come to terms with what Christianity means. Now, that's a very wordy bit of historical background to what modern art might mean for us and for the artists who draw such art, who depict these Christian scenes, these Christian works of art. Today, I have chosen, from amongst all of these more contemporary works of art, Salvador Dali's Christ of St. John of the Cross. This is the piece of art that's set before you who are in the room at the moment. It was painted in 1951, and to give you an example and an idea of how big the actual piece of work is, it's a piece of oil painting on canvas. Its actual size is about 240 centimetres tall, so it's somewhere up here, and about 150 centimetres wide, something like that. And you can see it today if you go to Kelvingrove, which is for the Scotsman amongst you, very good, in Glasgow. Top points, we're getting that. We've got for those joining online, we have some Scottish back rowers here in if you go to the Glasgow Light Museum, you will see there are several museums in Kelvin Grove, and that's where the painting is today. We see in this dramatic picture of the crucified Jesus hanging on the cross a sort of cerebral looking down over the rest of the world and over a lake complete with fishermen and boats. It's named after St. John of the Cross because of a drawing which St. John the Friar, the monk, the friar, made in the 1500s, and which became the inspiration for Dali's work here. And so St. John of the Cross was a spiritual writer, friar, and he had several visions of the crucified Jesus, of Christ on the cross, which he wrote down and sometimes depicted artistically. And Dali, many, many centuries later, has picked up on these ideas and on these visions, on these dreams, on these spiritual writings, and put them into a modern piece of art in the 1950s. Here, if you like, the modern artistic world has got this tether, has got this cord to the Christian era which preceded it many, many centuries before. So this is not just an abstract, random piece of art from the modern era, it is connected to the artistic medium, the artistic culture that preceded it. Still inspired by Christian theology of the past, you might say, rather than just negating it and ignoring it totally. Dali is imbuing, is filling the story of the crucifixion, the fact of the crucifixion, with new meaning in light of the shifting cultural contexts that he is living through, that he's helping in some ways to drive forward as an artist. Let's have a little look then at some of the things that we see in this painting in particular. Perhaps most notable amongst the features of this work is the absence of blood, of gore, or of any graphic detail which would fairly represent an act of crucifixion. We often hear that crucifixion was one of the most horrible ways of executing the prisoners and the opponents of the Roman Empire. But there's no blood or detailing of any kind in this painting, which is quite interesting. And Dali reported that in a dream he was urged not to add those details to his painting because he thought they would mar and disrupt the work of art. He deliberately did not want there to be all of that detail of the execution, crucifixion scene. He wanted to emphasize this dreamlike depiction of Christ hanging forward over the world onto the lake below. Themes of dreams and of lurid moments are not uncommon in the work of Dali, who, by the time of this painting in 1951, had garnered a reputation of being a surreal artist with a taste for the bizarre. So this convention-busting imagery in his art, this rather unusual assortment of ideas, is very much in keeping with his style. That same luridness is on show here, where the line of lake, of sky, of light and dark is seemingly thrown into a slightly unusual combination. The imposing colour of the cross itself all seems, while relatable, while not necessarily unattractive, slightly unnatural, out of place, perhaps like it's been put in a mirror and everything's been turned slightly upside down. A number of critics have remarked on the unusual emphasis on, well, what's interesting about, let's ask this question, what's interesting about the way in which Christ is depicted? Thinking about maybe other scenes you've seen in art. What is the sort of the positioning and the the orientation here of Christ? Anything that strikes you in the room as being slightly odd?
Well, then it's further up. It says, if we believe, as what we did for all time, that the heavens was where God was, then it's almost like a godlike.
Okay, so the idea of Christ being up in heaven already.
Yeah, no, but something higher.
Something higher. Okay, yeah, no, absolutely. One of the things that is often spoken about quite a bit, thank you for that, Elizabeth. One of the things that's often spoken about quite a bit with this painting is that Christ is sort of hanging forward. You can see the weight of Christ the man, Jesus the man, hanging forward off of the cross with that shadow that can depict the sort of slightly obscure angle in which he's sort of being held onto the cross by the nails. So we don't get facial expressions. We don't get this rather flat, flush depiction of the crucifixion, which, as we discussed in my second session, is highly typical of the late medieval and Baroque periods of Western art. There is a sense in which Christ is being shown to be a man with limbs, with muscles, with a body that is being suspended in the force of gravity. A characterization that is probably not really within the capacity of the medieval and Baroque artists to depict. It's an interesting story about this particular depiction of Jesus, because Dali used a sort of a stumped double, if you like, to get the angles exactly right, the way in which a man would hang if he were suspended by those nails. So very, very moving to see how.
It's obviously gone into all the physical aspects of it.
Yes, exactly. So there's a sense of physics. No, absolutely, Maggie. There's a sense in which this is meant to be a real depiction, yet in an environment, in a context which is actually quite surreal, which is what makes this such an interesting piece of work. The artwork is definitely full of biographical detail. The lake depicted at the bottom of the piece of art is not Gennesaret, or not, or not the River Jordan, or anywhere that we might imagine from the biblical records of the New Testament. It's actually a lake in Catalonia, which was where Dali was living at the time that he painted this depiction of the crucifixion. And as I've said, the body of Christ has the likeness of that of a stump double, and so there's no need to see his face because it's completely, in this case, irrelevant to the painting. Let's leave that there. Sorry.
He doesn't have thorns as well.
He doesn't have what? Sorry?
Thorns, like crown of thorns.
He doesn't have crown.
No, he doesn't.
He doesn't.
He doesn't.
No, indeed, which is quite interesting, isn't it? Because of this emphasis on not having a bloody or gory depiction of Christ. Quite interesting that that's been removed from this depiction. I'm going to stop speaking there because I'd like to ask some questions. First of all, before I say anything more, if anyone has any reflections.
I can see like Christ's acceptance of what has happened.
Yes. The generosity of spirit. Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. The acceptance of Christ's passion and death. Sorry, Elizabeth. Yes, you had something.
Maybe I missed at the beginning. Did Dali profess a faith? Was he confessing Christianity?
Well, it's very interesting you say that, because lots of people didn't like. Lots of artistic critics did not like this particular painting when it was painted, because all of Dali's previous work had been highly surreal and a-Christian, non-Christian. And so the fact that he returns to a very Christian theme speaks to some development in his own conscience, his own faith, but a sense in which he felt it was important that the artistic world was reminded that Christianity needs to be shown. It needs to be depicted even in this modern, surreal culture, this medium where everything has been jumbled up slightly. So very interesting. That's sort of half an answer, I know, to your question. But his preceding work, very much not now we see in the 50s, in this painting, a very, very confident depiction of Christ's suffering and death. So I've got a few questions which we can just play over in the room for a few minutes before we finish today. First of all, what spirituality might we be able to draw out from this painting, if any? What is its message? What is it saying about the Christian individual?
To me, it clearly depicts sacrifice.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So almost like in a heavy way.
Yeah,
Not
the weight
authority.
and the burdens of Christ's
The burden.
sacrifice really being shown very relatively, right? You know, I think we all know about the nature, like Maggie was saying earlier, you know, the physics of the human body. And Dali has used that reality, that fact, to depict Christ's sacrifice very potently. Submission, yeah, absolutely. A submission, that willful submission that you were bringing to bear earlier.
I see it as an office story told. I see it as a real modern art because of the story being told.
Okay,
That's how I see it.
okay, very good. Interesting.
Maybe the presence of God, that even the fact that he used his home of Catalonia in the foreground, I think the point he was trying to make is that even in the sun-soaked lakes of Catalonia, you still have God watching over you.
Yeah, indeed. So the idea that actually Christianity has a universal appeal in that sense. It doesn't matter about time and place, but he's there over the whole world in that sense.
Yeah, it's
no, absolutely.
Cosmic.
Cosmic. Yeah, I think that's a good word. Cosmic.
Yes.
I'll steal that one for next time.
Yes.
Cosmic, I think, certainly in the sense that there isn't really, there's no timestamp on this piece of art. There's no pinning down Christ to a particular place or time, like you were saying, RJ. You know, so I think cosmic is a very good word.
Although I think the style of the boat.
Style of the boats, yes. The style of the boats might be a bit old-fashioned. Yes, no, indeed.
Excuse me, I was going to say, how much does it follow the sort of school at that time, or the trend in art, or the fashion at that time, or is he complete? So is he following the fashion, or did he establish his own thing? I'm not too sure about that.
That's a very, very good question, Maggie. So the question for those online is whether Dali's art here is very much his own fashion, his own style of art, or is it following a particular trend?
School or trend.
A particular school of art.
Yeah.
The answer is that in some ways this is actually quite a conservative piece of art. This is actually returning to more traditional themes in art, whilst still having that surreal flavour, if you like. Which is why I emphasised earlier that there is sort of this string still attached to the old world of medieval Baroque art and the modern world as well. Dali's kind of fused these two things together, and one of the things that I might perhaps encourage us to think about is the fact that Christianity in art in the 20th century and the 21st century is often holding lots of different cultures and schools and trends together at the same time. And so there's this idea that Christianity doesn't reinvent the wheel every time a new piece of art comes out. Christianity is ultimately going to be something quite fixed and rooted. Yes?
Yeah, the opposite flip side from my perspective when I look at this as sacrifice is shame.
Shame.
It brings
Okay.
shame onto the people.
Okay.
And then I have a question to that.
Sure.
Do you know more of the detail of the scripture up top? What does it say? What is that?
You can have a quick...
It's not iron,
Is it not
that
the
bit in
iron?
there, or not?
Is it the original? Is it in Hebrew? Or in
So if we
Aramaic?
look here, it is the original inscription, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews,
Right.
which was written in Hebrew, Latin, and in Greek.
Aramaic.
Aramaic, sorry, it's not Hebrew. Yeah, I think that is just the traditional. That is the traditional the four letters.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
I think if you take the name in the books, is also referring back to Jesus as the fisher of men.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, Jesus is the fisher of men, very much depicted in the boats here.
Yes. And really good point. And then if you look at the sky above it as well, is that anything relevant? Because it's an evening scene, isn't it?
Also, it looks like a reflection.
Hmm?
The sky looks like a reflection.
So if it's an evening, why might it be an evening or late afternoon scene
Because the world went dark.
at 3 o'clock in the afternoon? Yeah, very good. Yeah, Jesus Christ traditionally was crucified in the afternoon at the ninth hour. Yeah, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So that's just an interesting bit of Dali showing that he knows what he's talking about, so to speak.
Even though
Yes, please.
many artists depict Jesus, the face, Dali seems to depict so much within us, emotion, even though we are not seeing the face.
And that comes back to that point that I think Andreas was making about shame, about the downcast look that looks down on humanity and on the rest of the world. Quite interesting. Yeah,
But
very
also
much so.
the shame is very much associated with people would then want to hide their faces.
Indeed.
You know, they should
Indeed.
show their faces.
Yeah, absolutely. Shame comes with concealing and hiding away. Absolutely.
And the way the cross is floating is showing the same.
It's floating.
Same
Yes,
thing
it's not.
as
Yes, exactly. The cross is a reality that's not. Going back to that idea of the cosmic order again. The cross is not just something locked down on the earth, but something that is a reality for the world, reality for Christians. Absolutely.
It's even quite amazing as well. It takes us back to this universality of Christ's story. Then we're all looking at this picture and we all interpret that it's Christ. It could be anybody.
Yes.
You know what I mean? But it
Yeah.
just shows you how
It shows how widespread that image of the cross has come in to our public our conscience,
yes.
our conscience as human beings. Absolutely, that we can all find that. We don't need to do a photo ID of Jesus
Yes, you don't need
to
to see
know
the
that
face.
that's the crucifixion, which is a very important point because it means that Christ's emotionality, his reality as a human being, as God suffering and dying on the cross, is what tells us and gives us his identity. It's a psychological identity. It's not just, finding Where's Wally in one of those big picture books. How about a brief... Sorry, Elizabeth, yes.
From the shadow, now just we might work out it's the light, and that's different to here, what you said about emotion. There's a light coming from higher up
Yes.
onto this part to create a shadow, and it's from there, which means that Jesus on the cross is at the right hand of where the light is.
Oh, that's very good. Jesus at the right hand of God the Father. That's very... so Elizabeth
And that
talking...
will be on, it's not accidental.
No, indeed. Elizabeth is talking about where the light is being cast onto the wood of the cross and how that is coming from the right-hand side. So the light source is coming from the right-hand side, which we might then conclude is the right-hand side of God, the Father of Christ. Why might this be one of the most enduring images of the crucifixion in our time? It's been called that. This depiction of the crucifixion is probably one of the most familiar in the artistic world today. There are so many others to consider. So why might this have been so enduring?
I think because we don't have to look at the face, the glory, and so it gives it. Because that's difficult. I know it may be difficult for us to have to consider what
Difficult.
that causes us to consider, say the gore, the
Yes.
the face, and all the blood. But this isn't. So it allows us to consider maybe with more ease to approach it.
Okay, an
and get
ease of
deeper-
approach because of the lack of
get
that
deeper,
gore,
be
the
able
lack of
to-
the face.
Be able
Okay.
to abide, to be able to dwell and abide, because the crucifixions, you say Ardwater in Low Church, where there's no cross, no crucifixes, I've talked about the difference in a town, it was the Catholic or Protestant.
Yes.
And I don't know if it is a comfortable thing, people brought up in Catholicism or Anglo-Catholicism, but that I'm so comfortable with it, and I think just maybe because of the sectarian nature of it.
Okay. that
but it's a very different thing that you have to think about rather than just seeing the plain cross.
than just
like the
see,
one
than
behind
just
you.
seeing. Okay, so that's very interesting. So the idea of seeing the body of Christ is very different from just seeing the plain wood of the cross. The idea of abiding in Christ's crucifixion when we don't have to tackle the violence of the nails, of the perhaps of the face crowned with thorns. I think that's a very
It's a different perspective.
different perspective. Okay.
Because
Yeah.
you're looking at his shoulders and the back of his head. You don't often see that.
No, you don't. I think that's right. It's a much more. It's an expression. It's an expression of Christ, which is signalling an emotional response. It's almost anticipating a response to Christ's death. The emotions of shame, for example, that we've spoken about. The emotions of the reality of sacrifice. One of the really, I think, important things about this painting is the fact that we are being invited to sort of find our Christian identity in this painting. We're not interested in the exact facial structure of Christ or his emotional agony in his face, or we're not trying to recreate the historical Jesus in this painting. We're being invited to place ourselves at the cross of Christ and find a sense of emotional reality and the reality of our lives lived in God in this painting. And so there's a sense in which all of our emotions about our faith are finding their expression. That's my hot take on that. And then finally, perhaps just interesting to note, why did Dali, we talked a little bit about this, I think Maggie has touched on this a little bit, why did Dali return to these more conservative Christian subjects rather than continue down the path of surrealism? So some of you will know that a very famous piece of surrealist art painted in 1931 called The Persistence of Memory. If you've seen this piece of art, it's characterised by a clock that's kind of looks like a liquid, it's kind of in half, and all these sorts of jumbled up signs and portents and images are kind of in this distorted surrealist picture. This is very different from what Dali was doing 20 years ago in the 1930s.
It's a very physical picture because of the bodily thing.
Very
You've not
physical.
got- You've not got all the blood and gore and all that sort of thing, but you've got the muscular, the way that at the back, or the way that it's affects the muscular structure, because that seems to be emphasised on that one.
Yes.
Only to me, I don't know what
Okay,
anybody
and
else
the
thinks.
emphasis on the body, the emphasis on the physicality of Christ. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's very true. But it's very interesting, I think, to reflect on this point, which we've teased out a little bit already. Dali very consciously returned to a normative and slightly more conservative piece of art depicting Christ, rather than continue down and down and down a path of an abstract and surrealist art. And the people of his time found that confusing. They found that interesting, and they found that perhaps surprising. And so that leads me on to perhaps just draw some of these points together as we come to a conclusion, and say that as we move forward in time in the artistic world, where we see new patterns and develop in art, new schools, new styles, new ways of painting, new types of materials used to depict art and paint art, we find Christianity there reminding us how there are still timeless and unchanging parts of our human nature which human beings are continually having to reevaluate and engage with. And one of the most powerful ways in which we can do that as people of faith is to look at the cross, is to look at the life of Christ as a man suffering, but with a divine mission, the Son of God, born of the Virgin Mary. And in Dali's depiction here, all of our emotions are met at the cross. The shame of Christ hanging forward over the world. The reality that it doesn't matter about time and space so much as the fact that he is above this cosmic order of things, this universal order of things, which we have to interpret and find our place in that's hard, and even if that means that there are lots of surreal images that have to be moved around and reconfigured in our own minds, but also on the page, also in art. So really interesting to see how Christianity changes in art more, in some respects. We've got that sense of perspective, but then we've also got that sense of it coming back to the roots of faith. It's encouraging artists also to remind the world that there are things about our faith that don't change, that speak to the human condition from one generation to another. In our next lecture, in our final talk, our final in our Art and Christianity series, I'm going to return us very much to St James's. So we're going to be looking at the stained glass in St James's and looking at the various different depictions of Christian themes and subjects in and around St James's Church. And so what we might do next week is, rather than just being here, we might go on a little bit of a walk around the church, having a look at some of the pieces of stained glass, having a look at our St James's crucifix, which is up on the pillar over there in the main sanctuary. And we will be thinking about the ways in which St James's, as a church that was built in the 1880s, can convey important themes of the Christian faith in various different types of ways, both new and old as well. That will be in 2 weeks' time on the 21st of June. For those who want a copy of the lecture, I can send out these notes to you by email, and then the talk is also available on Facebook and on YouTube, which I'm recording now, so that will be available the moment you log in to your computer or tablet or iPhone or whatever when you get home. I'll leave it there because otherwise it might get a little bit too late, but thank you all for joining, and I look forward to seeing you for the final session in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you.
Thank you.